white British working class underage girls be groomed and sexually abused over the course of 3 decades by this was really a horrific abuse of human rights. You've hired some young 22-year-old fresh out of college who is offended by anything and everything, and suddenly you've got these people policing your language and telling you, no, this story is not liberal enough, or bin Laden identified the faults of America correctly, and actually this guy may have had a point.
What made you create this Twitter account, the X account, Visegrad 24? And just tell me a bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? How did you go into sort of like public relations?
Sure. So I grew up in a very cosmopolitan and multicultural home. I have a South African father, a Polish mother. I was born in London. We grew up all around Europe. I've spent extensive times on the African continent, both in Northern Africa and sub-Saharan parts of Africa. And I've been living in Poland, mostly Warsaw, for the last few years. And the background around starting Visegrad 24 was motivated by perceived failures, real or not, of the mainstream media. And it was a realization that what the media was writing about Poland at the time and Central and Eastern Europe was completely unaligned with the way I was seeing things myself. And one of the biggest sort of moments of that sort of seeing things differently was the hybrid warfare attack by the Russian Federation in conjunction with the Lukashenko regime in Belarus on the Polish border. And it wasn't just the Polish border, it was the Finnish, the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian borders, where migrants were being flown in by various NGOs into Minsk airport and then bussed to the Polish border and to other borders as part of an operation to destabilize the West. This is being done in conjunction with price hikes on gas. So, for example, Nord Stream 1 there was a constriction of the amount of gas that was being pumped through the pipeline in order to raise prices across Europe. And this is all being done in preparation for the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And there was a fascinating sort of dissonance between what the media was writing, referring to this as a humanitarian crisis, referring to the migrants, the illegal migrants that were being bussed to the Polish border as refugees, even though there was no logic to it, right? How would a Sudanese man end up on the Polish-Belarusian border trying to cross, even if he was a legitimate refugee? It made no sense to take that route. So there was, and obviously this is a real tragedy of the people involved, that the illegal migrants who are being weaponized by the Kremlin in a very cynical way. These people are obviously victims of this procedure, and my full empathy goes out to these people. But that doesn't mean that I would want to open the Polish border to them, and the media was writing about it as a refugee crisis and condemning the Polish border, the Polish army for closing the border, and then condemning the Poles for putting up a big wall, or a fence rather, and essentially safeguarding its borders. And that was really when Visegrad took off. It was me realizing that the media, I mean, was either incredibly naive, that these were mostly left-wing international outlets, The Guardian, Le Monde, and other outlets, were either incredibly naive or were flat out lying. And that was really that's where Visegrad took off. And that was 2021. So it had existed since January 2020. And it was just an account which was used to post news from Central and Eastern Europe. And then that was really the moment where our reporting was picked up by mainstream media. It led to a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions. And here we are 4.5 years later. The last 12 months have been 7.3 billion impressions, 1.1 billion video views. a YouTube channel that's gone to zero from zero to 85,000 subscribers in 8 months and 55 million YouTube views. And we're sort of we've launched an investigative unit that does sort of, so it's no longer just posting stories from Central and Eastern Europe. It's outgrown that. We now have a fully fledged investigative unit, which our journalists spent 4 months undercover at 7 American universities, documenting anti-Semitism amongst the staff, amongst the student bodies, amongst the administrations of these universities. That led to Mohammed Abdu, the visiting Archipelagic Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, being fired by former President Manouche Shafiq, who was made to testify in Congress. And the undercover videos that were filmed by our undercover unit were quoted repeatedly by several congressmen and congresswomen. And that was, that was a very fine example of proper investigative deep cover work. And that's where we're taking Visegrad. From being a social media based news aggregator to a fully fledged news company.
So let me ask you this. Let's just go back to the origin of Visegrad.
Sure.
There was this refugee crisis.
Mm-hmm.
These refugees, were they mostly Middle Eastern, African? Who were they? And were they coming into Russia, and then Russia was busing them onto the Polish border? Is that what was going on?
It's roughly what was happening. These were migrants from the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea. I believe there's some Djiboutians amongst them, certainly Ethiopians, but also further along, so Sudan, South Sudan, and a few other African countries, and then many Middle Eastern countries. Much of the languages, many of them at the border were speaking Arabic. The procedure, I can't remember exactly what airports they're flown through. I believe that many of the flights were taking place from Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, and they were being flown to Minsk, primarily to Minsk. There may have been a Russian city involved. I'd have to double check that. And then they were being bused to the Polish border, and Belarusian border guards would be pushing them across. I mean, this was really a horrific abuse of human rights. These were essentially poor people from what's now called the global south, who'd been made promises about being greeted as refugees and giving a safe home and a better life, being exploited by the Kremlin and their cronies and their proxies.
But why Russia? Why was they were flown into Russia? What was the reason behind that? That, as you said, was there something going on, a conspiracy, or I just
no. The Russians, before they invaded Ukraine in 2022, were keen to. They generally had a policy of destabilizing and of weakening the West before the invasion took place, and this was one of the many hybrid warfare operations that they had. So, like I said, the other big thing that Russia was doing was, in that winter in 2021, it was leading to price hikes of energy. This was incredibly painful to many Europeans. It led to many protests across Europe. It led to severe inflation, and it led to massive penury. And then this was amplified by Russian media operations and by Russian bots. So these tensions were being stoked. And so there was a real frustration of the cost of energy, of heating one's own house in the winter, and this was felt really across all of Europe, and this was then exploited by these Russian trolls who were busy amplifying it and sort of.
And we will talk about that in a minute. I want to know. So Russia essentially volunteered that they can have refugees fly from Iraq, for example, into Russia, and then Russia will help them get into Europe. That was, that essentially.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was there any mainstream news media outlet that was reporting at the time that this could be a massive conspiracy to destabilize Europe by allowing all these people, many of them sort of like military-age men, as a lot of conservative media talks about? Was there any mainstream media outlet that even mentioned this possibility?
There were obviously Polish media outlets which were talking about it.
I meant was like Western media, like the CNN or the Guardian. Like, the reason you said you created Visegrad was because of this lack of reporting. I just want to know.
It's an interesting question. I can't. This is obviously, you're asking me things from 3.5 years ago, so I'm doing my very best to go through my mind and to try and remember. From memory, I can't think of any that would have described it that way. Certainly, it was well documented in Polish media, and at the time, the conservative government also, I mean, made their position very clear and explained why it was doing the things it was doing. Um, and that was the reason. It was because it wasn't. It was a falsely created refugee crisis. Um, yeah, I can't remember any international media outlets writing about it that way, actually.
So which led you to create your own platform that can report about this issue on an ongoing basis. I mean,
Sure,
I live in America. I live in New York City. Like I live in
sure.
Jersey City, which is like only a few minutes away from
Mm,
Manhattan. And I see the effects of mass migration. And the
mm,
mayor is now openly saying he's a liberal Democrat mayor. He's openly saying that this issue will destroy New York City. So
sure.
I can see why people say that. Look, if you allow mass migration into a country, that does destabilize a lot of places. And go around America, and you will find out a lot of liberal cities, they are not livable
Mhm.
anymore. So I can see, but I guess my question would be, so that led you to create Visegrad. What was some of the most sort of like some of the reporting that was highlighted by the mainstream media that you guys did, that you guys highlighted?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, one of the one of the things I'm most proud of is our ongoing documentation of the silent genocide in Nigeria, where Christians have been targeted by Islamist militias for the last few years to the complete and utter silence of the world. It's a great tragedy. It's cost the lives of 150,000 Christians so far. Our reporting led to, and we've been covering this in an ongoing way. Our reporting led to a resolution being passed in the European Parliament, and multiple mostly conservative outlets picking the story up, especially after the Christmas massacre that took place last year in 2023, where several hundred people were killed in a massacre that was absolutely brutal and horrifying. The other work that we have done that has led to some good consequences was there was a balloon that was released over JFK Airport, and one of the air controllers who filmed the event sent us the footage. So we were the first to publish this footage. That led to an FBI inquiry into potential act of domestic terrorism. Obviously, the aim of this huge balloon that was released over the airport was to disrupt air traffic. Could have led to a very serious accident. So that was another story that we broke that led to multiple articles and much coverage in the mainstream press. Um, many of the stories that we broke about the Israel-Hamas war, which we have been one of the leading commentators and accounts documenting it. That's been we've done a lot of work around that, and I think the mainstream media, which has repeatedly distorted the truth in favor of Hamas in this kind of misguided sense that there is some equivalency between Israel and this terrorist group that is keeping Gazans hostage. Um, that really we've managed to cover that in a way without falling for many of the stories that much of the mainstream press fell for, including, for example, right at the beginning of the war, the alleged bombing by Israel of a hospital in Gaza and the deaths of allegedly 500 Palestinians. This turned out to be not only not a rocket fired by the Israeli side, but fired by one of the Islamist organizations within Gaza, and the death toll was considerably lower. But the mainstream press latched onto this story, latched onto the figures posted by the Hamas Ministry of the Hamas-run Ministry of Health of Gaza, and ran with it. And the incredible thing was that this story of Israel allegedly bombing a hospital and killing 500 Palestinians in that hospital led, which was highlighted by Western and American media outlets, including the New York Times and CNN. And I mean, there were headlines. The headlines were absolutely scandalous across the U.S. Led to mass protests in multiple majority Muslim countries, and in two of them, and if memory serves me right, one of them was Turkey. There was an attempted attack at an American consulate in direct retaliation, and on an Israeli consulate as well. So this was the mainstream media taking a story with and posting this fake news story as a reality, which led to very serious consequences. And I believe that we have obviously gotten some stories wrong. Nobody is perfect. And I don't think there is a journalist in the world who hasn't fallen victim to some extent of fake news. But I'm very proud of the coverage that my team and I have done of this war. I think that we have restored some semblance of a balance. And obviously, the same way that we are accused of leaning pro-Israel, well, the reason we do, and I don't deny that, the reason we lean that way is because so much of the media seems to lean pro-Palestine, um, with no real rationale as to why they should really lean pro-Palestine as well.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah,
You guys have been active for 4 years now, and you've
sure.
grown from just an X account to this multimedia agency
Hmm.
or organization. Do you
Yep.
see any difference or any change in the reporting of the mainstream media now, given that there's a lot of citizen journalists like yourself filling the void? Are they learning from you guys and changing their tactics, or they're still stuck in their older mindset that they're the sort of gatekeepers of information?
I would say that the the mainstream media, and again, it's obviously it depends on how we define the mainstream media, but if we define mainstream media as the great legacy organizations that dominated and that, as you pointed out correctly, gatekept the truth and and were the shapers of I mean there's a reason media is called the fourth estate. There is an incredible power in the ability to shape a narrative and to frame a story, and it's a power that is not to be underestimated. The fundamental reason that the mainstream media is not currently adapting as fast as it potentially should is because it has a captive audience of older people. There was a report released recently, and I don't want to quote it because I don't entirely remember the numbers, but I believe that the median age of the viewers of MSNBC and CNN, if memory serves me right, was around the mid to late 60s, which is a very interesting figure because that's an audience that's not going to change the way it consumes media. So there is a runway left of that audience of if we take, average Western life expectancy being around 80, then they have another 12, 15 years of a very captive audience that's not going to adapt and that's not going to change. So from that perspective, I don't know if there's a massive incentive for these organizations to change. I also think that even with the rise of citizen journalism, I don't think that the demise of legacy press is necessarily going to happen. I don't think there's going to be a complete destruction of legacy press, and I also don't think that would be a good thing. For a variety of reasons. I think that the legacy press.
I mean, like people in America, people like Tucker Carlson are
Sure.
saying they are actually advocating, encouraging the Trump campaign, just to give you one example from
Hmm.
Tucker, that not to engage with the mainstream media. And if I take an impartial look at the way the mainstream media behaves in this country, I unfortunately reached the same conclusion. The way they have covered the Trump campaign, I unfortunately reached the same conclusion not to engage with them until they improve their reporting and are a lot more balanced and impartial in their reporting, not to engage with them. But it's interesting, you are saying that you don't see the demise of media. And there's a lot of people in America, we are
Mm.
always seeing it. In our opinion, they're causing their own demise. Some words on that.
In I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't think that mainstream media is going to disappear overnight. That's the broad argument that I would make. And you pose a very interesting question. Should one engage with them or not? Um, I mean, look, I come from a place that's highly critical of the mainstream media. This is precisely why I built Visegrad, and Visegrad obviously functions as this sort of new media tool, and it does have some influence. I mean, 7.3 billion impressions in a 12-month period is an impressive number. Um, but the more the concern that I have is with citizen journalism. And the same way, look, that there has been a certain capture of mainstream media by a certain group of individuals in the sense of individuals with a certain mindset. And for a variety of reasons, they tend to lean left. They tend to lean Democrat in the United States of America. They tend to be from certain backgrounds. So obviously sort of upper middle class. There's a there's a large number of factors for why that's the case. Partially because journalism is to some extent a prestige job. So you have to come from a slightly wealthier background in order to be able to do the unpaid internships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you end up having a very specific demographic in many of these news companies. But I wouldn't be, look, I wouldn't be entirely critical of, I don't want to sort of, I don't want to stand here and sort of defend mainstream media, especially given the fact that I've literally, the last 4 years of my life, I've been dedicated to building something directly in opposition to it. But there is a number of things that the mainstream media does that is not done by citizen journalism. I mean, including something as silly as weather reports, which are a useful product, right? So I wouldn't want to knock it completely in the sense of I think it would be unfair to come out here and say, the mainstream media completely sucks, got no respect for it, they do nothing right. I don't think that's a fair assessment of it. I don't know if that makes any sense, Azhar.
Mainstream media. You see a place for the mainstream media in the conversation, in the sort of like the overall conversation. There's a place for the mainstream media.
I wouldn't, if there are people who want to consume that kind of news, and if there is a demand for it, then I don't see why there shouldn't be a supply. The criticism can just as easily be made of outlets and operations like mine, right? You could say, well, the difference between me and the mainstream media and Visegrad and the mainstream media is that I'm very open about the biases that we have. We position ourselves as an unapologetically pro-Western outlet. Everything that we do is done ultimately from a belief that we must defend and safeguard the values, beliefs, and principles that made the Western world into what it is today. And what we are today is the pinnacle of human achievement for a variety of reasons. And I think that's where the reporting that we do and the coverage that we do and the focus of the team is on that. It's on safeguarding those principles. And also when it isn't directly linked to that, it is about warning the West about many of the issues plaguing the non-Western world. As Kipling once wrote, to paraphrase Kipling, or rather to expand on him, he sort of said this famous line in a poem of, what do they know of England who only England know? And I think that can be expanded to, what do they know of the West who only the West know? And I have spent sufficient amounts of time in the Arab world and in sub-Saharan Africa to say that, I wouldn't want the West to be that. And there is a reason, and there are a multitude of them, and this is something that needs to be explored and understood, of why Europe and North America do not look like sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle Eastern world. And there are many factors at play here. And that's that's the sort of point where I come out of. And I think that's part of the success of Visegrad 24, is that we have been very clear where our bias lies. So we're not telling anyone, oh, this is impartial, completely objective news. No, we've been very open about the fact that we lean conservative and that we are pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic relations, that we are pro-democracy, that we are pro-personal freedoms, and obviously in many ways.
That's where I disagree with the mainstream media.
Sure.
That they do position themselves, and frankly, the mainstream liberal media does position themselves as being this impartial, balanced news organization, the most trusted name in journalism.
Sure.
But when you look at their reporting, it's very one-sided on some issues, very one-sided on other issues. So I end up scratching my head. I'm like, if you are positioned, I completely agree with you. If you say that, look, I have this bias and I don't position myself as a news entity, it's more about sort of like a warning and creating opinions, that is completely fine with me. But when it comes to especially the American mainstream liberal media, the way they package themselves and what they actually do is quite different. Let me give you one example. When I believe her name was Lindsay Janice, I could be wrong, from ABC. she went to her producers saying that she's got everything on
Jeffrey Epstein.
Epstein, right? And they told her, look,
Sure.
nobody cares about Epstein. Nobody
It
cares
was
about
about it was about 15 years ago. That's sure.
right,
Sure,
right.
sure. I'm familiar with it rings a bell through it was ABC News. You're entirely correct, and the story was bottled. Yeah.
And and the interesting thing was the line that she kept on repeating that her producers or the managers in her company told her was that nobody cares about Epstein or Prince Andrew. And when
Mm,
from my own experience working in the liberal mainstream media, when I
sure.
would go to them with stories that I thought were extremely interesting, and they would repeat the same line to me, no one cares about that. Why are you working on it? Which made me realize that they will push a certain narrative about on some things. Like I said, they're on one side of some issues, the other side of some
Sure.
issues. And the reason I bring it up is because, yeah, like I said, if you're packaging yourself as a truly journalistic entity, but then you're behaving as a news organization that has a lot of biases, and you're
Mm,
not allowed to challenge or even question those biases,
mm.
um, that's where my problem happens, right? That's where, yeah.
But you have this kind of sense of you. I mean, obviously, the difference between the two of us is you worked in the liberal media.
Mm.
So you have a first-hand insight and understanding of what was going on within. Give me an idea of how many of the people who were there, of your co-workers, how liberal was it?
I would say there was definitely some closet conservatives who
Hmm.
would talk to me, and they would be like, you got to be very judicious when it comes to expressing or your opinion on some issues. There were definitely a lot of liberal people, but
Sure.
it's not entirely liberal. A lot of people simply have opinions, they don't share those opinions,
Sure.
they just go with the flow to protect their jobs. A
Mm,
lot of people are moderate actually work in the news media organizations that I work for, the liberal ones. A lot of
correct.
people are moderate, but they don't share their opinion on a lot of issues. They just go with what the directive is.
Because a really fascinating insight into the modern liberal media world is obviously the story of Barry Weiss and the
Hmm.
story of the capture of the New York Times by not journalists themselves, but by the HR department. And it was this idea that, conservatives were warning about the capture of universities in the US and saying, look, there's these radical lefties on campuses, and we should start addressing this, and we should start potentially trying to de-radicalize these lefties. And much of the reaction of of essentially society, really, I'm not even saying the liberal establishment, but just sort of society at large, saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. These guys are going to grow out of it, and these girls and boys are going to grow out of it." And this was the interesting kind of, I guess, the kind of the beginning of the culture wars, the ones in the sort of the early teens, the 2012 to 2014, that sort of slightly pre-Trump era of these kind of college campus debates and the rise of these right-wing YouTubers. And there were all these very popular videos at the time of owning the libs and quite silly sort of titles like that. But there were all these debates on campuses, and you could sense this radicalism. And then these people graduated university and went into various jobs and many of them ended up in a lot of HR departments. And suddenly the HR department ends up essentially policing your speech. So you've hired some young 22-year-old fresh out of college who is offended by anything and everything. And suddenly you've got these people policing your language and telling you, no, this story is not liberal enough, or this perspective isn't left-wing enough. And suddenly you've become a hostage in your own company. I think that's a very interesting thing. I've actually seen this in the non-media world. A few of my friends who managed to grow their companies to slightly bigger numbers, to sort of 50 to 100 employees, have had stories like this of hiring people for HR. The company grows bigger, they need someone to take care of new hires and new recruits. And I've had these guys who've friends of mine who've ended up suddenly finding themselves in a work environment which was radically different than the company that they set up, because the HR department had fallen captive to essentially what's referred to as today, a sort of woke HR person who suddenly introduces various sort of be it DEI or be it taking people to anti-racist training and etc. And it sort of festers and and that's how and I believe that that's probably a lot of the case in the liberal media, right? It's an interesting insight from you that you mentioned that many of the people that you work with were actually fairly moderate. But the actual narrative of the institution or the organization as a whole leaned much heavily to the left than the majority of the employees, which suggests that
It's interesting you say that because I don't personally I don't believe that much of the narrative leaned on the left. I believe it on some issues it was on the left, on some issues it was on the right. It very much worked like a propaganda machine. I'm
sure,
not going to shy away from using that word. And the
sure,
reason I say that currently, it's my opinion that the mainstream liberal media has created a perception around the Western world, which even if there was a nuclear strike on a Muslim country at the moment, in my
yes.
opinion, it would be accepted in much of the Western world. It would be tolerated because of the perception that the mainstream liberal media has created of Muslim countries. And so because of which I say that they're on some issues, they're on the left, on some
So
issues,
would
they're
you
on the
would
right.
you say that the liberal mainstream media is Islamophobic
I
in the
would
sense that it would defend a nuclear strike on a Muslim country?
So I'm not saying that they would defend. I'm saying that the overall messaging that has been coming out to the mainstream liberal media has created this environment where it would be tolerated and accepted. They wouldn't be defending it, but the way propaganda works. You do some stories to position yourself as this independent journalistic
Sure,
entity, but then you're doing 10 others. Rula Jibrail, I believe was her name. She was an MSNBC commentator, and
sure.
she at
She
this
was
point.
she was one of the subjects of one of our investigative journalists,
Okay.
Pete from University. Yes, but correct. Yeah, Ula Jibril.
So
Yeah,
she was on MSNBC and she challenged the MSNBC reporters, saying that for 6 days you had Israeli commentators on your television channel. 8 hours you're talking about their viewpoint is going out, and then for one day you invite me, and then you say that you're a sort of like a truly journalistic entity. And she lost her job because of this criticism. She lost her job the next day. So that's
fascinating.
the point I'm trying to raise. That in my opinion, yes, it is leftist to the most part, but the overall perceptions that they end up creating into the minds of people that are consuming that media, it's very much like propaganda. On some issues they're promoting right-wing policies, on some issues it's left-wing policies.
But wouldn't you say that this is merely a function of the people who are the customers of those outlets? I mean, let's not forget that, for example, I mean, the media companies that their biggest clients tend to be pharmaceutical companies on one hand, and big tobacco companies, the big tobacco four, massive, massive financiers of media, right? So you have, and the coverage during COVID, I think was very interesting because if you've got institutions that are heavily funded by pharmaceutical companies, you're going to end up that's going to end up reflecting in your journalism. The same way that if you're a university and you're taking big gifts and presents from countries such as Qatar, that's going to be reflected in your educational line somewhere down the line, right? So wouldn't you say that that's more a um, I mean, it's interesting what you say because I, for example, think that the liberal media has, broadly speaking, been very, very supportive of the Hamas line. I mean, to me, I mean, obviously, I might be wrong. Perhaps I haven't consumed enough liberal media, but to me, the feeling has been that the journalism that we've seen has been overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, in the sense of, especially using the figures provided by the Hamas-run Gazan Ministry of Health and taking those numbers at face value. From that perspective, I think that the coverage has usually been actually quite anti-Israeli, which is surprising, um, given that the US is on one hand such a huge ally to the state of Israel and has been for decades. Um, and secondly, unexpected, um, especially given I guess the coverage that had been very supportive of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan so many years ago, that a media that did actually was in many ways complicit in these invasions. And wrongfully so, right? Iraq and Afghanistan, it was obviously none of the West's business to enter those countries at the time. And I don't think that obviously the conclusion of what happened in Afghanistan and the shameful withdrawal of the US and the betrayal of thousands of Afghan citizens who had been helping the US forces on the ground, a tragic betrayal. Um, it's interesting that that same media would then be kind of perhaps ironically so in some sense, pro-Palestinian.
You mentioned something very interesting a few moments ago about influence. Do you think there is domestic and foreign influence within the media landscape, be it mainstream media or social media?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it comes from nefarious state actors wanting to undermine the West, who they see as a historic opponent by some and some as an ideological opponent. We see it on one hand from the Chinese. Their main tool is obviously TikTok, which has an algorithm that is definitely weaponized against the West. And you see it even with the way the algorithm has been used to increase tensions around the Israel-Hamas war. So the amplification of pro-Palestinian protests in the West on TikTok, the entire generations of girlies for Hamas in the West, these young girls who've got no understanding of the Israel-Hamas war, no understanding of what Gaza is, no understanding of what Hamas is, suddenly being great advocates of the Palestinian cause. It's completely inorganic, absolutely amplified by the Chinese algorithm. You see it with the Russians and their influence operations. So that would be Russia Today, and then a combination of troll farms, very effective, and highly involved in the narratives shaping the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that has been a key focus of the Russians. And the other interesting thing the Russians are doing online is they're very focused on the what was known as the Third World and now is referred to as the Global South. So you see, it's fascinating to see the amount of Russian-funded propaganda in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Arab world, which is stoking tensions. So a lot of content being made about colonialism and how the white man destroyed Africa. A lot of it is being orchestrated, organized, funded, produced by Russia and Russian propagandists. You then see it with the Iranians. They have a number of influence operations. And obviously one of the most successful states, ironically the smallest in size, is Qatar. Small Gulf country, 300,000 inhabitants. And it absolutely masterful. It's a masterclass in propaganda, a masterclass in PR, a masterclass in country branding. So you have the Qataris on one hand buying up key Western institutions, be it Harrods, Claridge's, the Connaught, the Shard in London, Sainsbury's, Barclays, Heathrow Airport even. And then you have their funding of Western universities and the creation of Education City in Doha. So buying up the prestige of Western institutions and bringing them to Qatar. And then you have their influence operation, which isn't just obviously focused on the Western world. You have Al Jazeera in English and you have Al Jazeera Arabic, which is an influence operation around the Arab world itself. And it's a very interesting case because the Qataris present themselves as a modern Arab state, present themselves as this great mediator. They are classified as a major non-NATO US ally. The largest US base in the Middle East is in Qatar. And yet, when the US was at war with the Taliban elites and leadership was busy living in Doha, the same way that the Hamas leadership during the Israel-Hamas war has been based in Doha. And the Qataris, it's part of that nexus. Obviously it's more aligned with Iran than anyone else, but the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and Qataris all have their own reasons, ideological, historical, financial, economic, to destabilize the West. And they're all doing it through subversion methods that involve using the media, that involve using influences on the ground. And obviously, in the case of the two Muslim cases, so the Iranians and the Qataris, they've obviously been using as well the large Muslim diasporas that are now living in the West. And you see this partial. I mean, Qatar, obviously, the subversion goes on an even. You can, to give you an example of subversion on an even deeper level. In the European Union, you have members of the European Parliament. The Russians had, for every German member of the European Parliament working in Brussels and Strasbourg, the Russians had 12 lobbyists on average working on every single one of them to support their causes, be it Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, be it obviously deeper cooperation for a variety of reasons, all the way up to the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That gives you a very vague idea of the scale of the subversion. Then to take it a level deeper, the Qataris were busy paying off a large number of the members of the European Parliament. The deputy president of the European Parliament, Eva Kaili, who was a Greek member of the European Parliament, was literally paid to write amendments to EU resolutions condemning human rights abuses in the Middle East and Qatar in the wake of the Qatari World Cup. So that subversion is very visible. Again, in Washington, there was successful infiltration by Iranian spies. We saw that with the case of Menendez. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Bob Menendez. There was a Qatari.
My local congressman.
Correct. Yes.
Literally my local congressman, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's the subversion is very much there. And what's interesting is that the European Union, after the invasion of Ukraine, made a move to ban all Russian media operations. So that's Russia Today, RIA Novosti, Rossiyskaya Gazeta, etc. So there's a number of Russian outlets that have been banned from operating within the European Union, obviously because there was an allied country that was invaded, and these outlets were being used to promote hostile propaganda to the West. And it has to be stated clearly, Russia is a hostile state to the West. And what is interesting, however, is that you have the Qataris who are busy funding a number of terrorist organizations and funding Islamic cultural centers across Europe. They're funding mosques across Europe. They're funding Muslim schools across Europe.
When you say funding, is it like literally giving money to these institutions?
Literally giving money. The Qatar
how does this happen? Are there organizations coordinating all of this on the ground, or
there's a Qatari charity, the Doha-based Qatar charity is the one that's organizing it. I mean, from the London Central Mosque, which is one of the largest mosques, it's received a very generous grant recently. There's literally mosques in Slovenia recently that have been funded. There's a large amount of Qatari money pouring in to the West, and obviously you can argue that there's an ever increasing number of Muslims. There's a genuine need for mosques in Europe because the Muslims, unlike Western Christians, have not walked away from their faith. The Muslims in the West have generally not atheized or secularized at the same speed as native Europeans, and. But the point I was trying to make about the Qataris is
why the government not sort of like the country that, for example, we talking about the UK. How come the government is not doing anything about this?
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that with the European countries have banned Russian influence operations, but Al Jazeera English still functions there, right? And Al Jazeera English very clearly, it's very subtle. It's an incredibly clever operation because they have AJ Plus, for example, which presents itself as a forward-thinking, modern, hip, young, cool, edgy, social justice fighting institution. And then you have this very soft, included within those videos, very well edited, very well made, well presented with Western hosts most of the time. Then you have this kind of soft propaganda. It's very well done. I mean, it really is a masterclass in propaganda of soft promotion of the Muslim Brotherhood, soft promotion of terrorist organizations, soft promotion of Wahhabi Islamism, and then you have it obviously on a greater scale in Al Jazeera English. To the extent that recently the Al Jazeera coverage of the violence against Hindus in Bangladesh, um, Al Jazeera wrote another amusing piece, which was more concerned about Islamophobia in Bangladesh than it was about Indians getting butchered and beaten up in the streets of Bangladesh. Um, and nothing's being done. So these influence operations, the same with TikTok. There's been a divestment bill pushed through Congress, which should lead to a change in ownership of TikTok. Um, because it's very obviously a foreign influence tool. And there was a fascinating case on TikTok recently of the letter to America written by bin Laden, in which bin Laden explains why he attacked America. And you really can't make this up. A number of TikTokers rediscovered this letter, which had been written 20 something years ago now. And these are all people born post 2001. And you had a kind of communal reading session of multiple TikTokers reading this letter to America and saying, Bin Laden identified the faults of America correctly, and actually this guy may have had a point. And there was this kind of rehabilitation session of the mastermind of 9/11 being done by the next generation in America. And this reminds me of a famous quote, and I believe it was Eisenhower who told his troops, and I can't quote the exact quote, but he said as American troops were moving through Germany and occupied territories and liberating concentration and extermination camps, he said, document everything. In 20 years, people will say this never happened. And I kind of, his 20-year time frame is interesting, right? Because, obviously you've got Holocaust denial on a major scale today, but you have again the two towers in New York, a city that you live in and you probably love, that were taken down by terrorists. And 20 years later, you've got American kids sitting on TikTok on foreign technology, whitewashing a terrorist from the other side of the world who attacked, the Big Apple. It's incredible. And that tells you about the effectiveness of these tools. It really does. I think this combination of algorithms, TikTok really is it's the crack cocaine of social media. It's like you're playing a slot machine. You swipe, and even the mechanism of swiping is almost like sitting at a slot machine, and you don't know, maybe the next video is going to be that dopamine rush that you needed. Maybe not. Maybe it won't be. And you kind of keep scrolling in the hope that something amazing is going to come out of it, and he's sort of sucked into this loop. And in that loop, in that algorithm, the Chinese have most definitely involved. And this weaponization of TikTok works in a multifaceted way, from promoting content that shows China in a positive light, to content that shows communism in a positive light, to the sexualization of young girls. I mean, there's been an acceleration, and obviously there's an argument that goes, the more promiscuous a society, the weaker it gets. So there's an argument that the sexualization of young women in the West is also in essence a form of a hybrid attack. And TikTok's absolutely done this to perfection.
Give me some examples. What exactly, when you say sexualization of young girls, what exactly do you mean?
So the content, I mean, it's the trends that are promoted that are obviously content. The content on TikTok isn't there isn't, unlike X, which I think should definitely ban pornography for the record. I think that the OnlyFans girls who spam our replies with their content, it's insufferable. I really hope X does make a move on banning smart, but obviously TikTok doesn't allow nudity or anything like that, but it's these dance trends that you see of young girls dancing away, often in a provocative way. There's a lot of that, and it's very easy content to make. It's very replicable, but it does. I mean, there's
So what you're saying is that these content creators are creating organic content, but the algorithm is selectively promoting content that fits within China's propaganda?
I would argue that. I obviously can't prove any of it, but I would argue that that's very much the case. Yes.
And
And
if they're go ahead.
the one thing that has been proven is the NCRI Institute did a number of studies around the promotion of hashtags, and they compared social media. So they took Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and they did an analysis of a ratio of content to hashtag. And they did an analysis of how much pro-Israeli content there was on each platform and how much pro-Palestinian, based on hashtags like, you know, stand with Gaza or stand with Israel, taking all of those hashtags. And it turned out, it transpired that there was something like, if memory serves me right, I believe it was 57 pieces of content that were pro-Palestinian on TikTok to every single pro-Israeli piece of content. And you can argue that maybe the demographic is such that that is a natural result, and that maybe there's just 57 times more support for Israel, for Palestine than there is Israel. But then I would come with my counter argument that says Visegrad 24 was permanently banned on TikTok. And we've posted a whole range of content. We went to Israel, filmed a series of 400 short videos, street interviews on the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Ashkelon. And these were basically ask an Israeli, right? That's what they were. There wasn't a strong bias, and obviously the content, the answers were often pro-Israeli. We went from having on average about 100,000 views a video to, when we started posting the Israeli content, we barely ever broke 1,000 views. There was a very clear algorithmic suppression of our content, and then we were permanently banned and unable to contest the decision. And there was no
was the reason for the banning? What was the reason given?
There was none provided. We were permanently banned, and there was. It was very upsetting because it's a very large channel. There's over 200,000 followers. And so I've experienced firsthand the suppression of pro-Israel content. So when I believe that what NCRI did, I think conclusively shows that the algorithm boosts and amplifies pro-Palestine content, and I think it also removes pro-Israeli content for a variety of reasons.
Do you what's stopping them from actually funding or giving money to influencers, social media influencers, so to speak, to create content, social media influencers that people follow, people think this is organic content? If they're doing all of this, and so what's stopping them from actually funding social media influencers?
I think there are organizations in the West that fund influencers. I mean, we've seen there've been. I mean, it's very interesting to look at the funding behind organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace. There is a whole funding mechanisms. Much of the protests and the occupation protests, the tent cities that were set up outside of various universities, temporarily occupied zones, temporarily occupied Palestinian zones. We've seen them pop up. We've even seen them pop up on European campuses. There is an interesting thing where you see that very often all the tents are the same. And clearly they all came from the same funder, because that's the reason that they weren't organically bought by students who brought their tent, but someone provided 300 tents to the occupation ground. I don't know to what extent states like Russia or Iran would directly fund influencers. I don't think that they're probably stupid enough to do that. But then you see the Jackson Hinkles of the world, and Jackson Hinkle, there isn't a nefarious state, there isn't a dictator, there isn't an authoritarian leader that Jackson Hinkle will not shill for, be it Maduro in Venezuela or be it the Houthis in Yemen. Jackson Hinkle appears to be supportive of all of them. You got to wonder if someone like Hinkle isn't paid. I mean, with very impressive reach and great numbers and a substantial influence on X, supporting all of these nefarious causes. But I don't believe that influencers are directly funded. I think there is an indirect funnel. And I think you see it if you look at the funding of organizations like Student for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voices for Peace, you see this nexus of American nonprofits and NGOs. It'd be interesting to trace the money. I don't know if there's any direct links to the countries that I specifically mentioned, though.
But what do you think about content moderation on social media?
Um, it's a really interesting question, Azhar, because like I've said, I've over time, the more Visegrad grows, the more influence we have, the more of a responsibility I have on my shoulders, given that I understand that there are potential real life consequences of posting something that isn't true, or of posting a mistake, or of getting something wrong. And the example that I gave you was the bombing of that hospital being reported by the New York Times and other news organizations as being bombed, definitely by Israel. Israelis killed 500 people. Bam, you've got literal riots in several cities caused by that piece of news. Those are very serious real life ramifications of getting a story wrong. And had the riots gotten out of hand, you may have even had some Israeli diplomats murdered in some random consulate somewhere in the Muslim world. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it could have. So when you talk about content moderation, and again, this is interesting because Elon Musk has applied the American First Amendment in a very liberal way to X. And so you do, right? And lying is ironically protected by free speech, I believe.
It is.
It is, isn't it?
Supreme Court ruled, I believe, in the 1950s that fake news or lying is a prerequisite for a society that wants free speech.
And so, I've had this argument with a lot of Jewish friends, and Jewish friends of mine would very often argue for wanting to suspend or ban the accounts of people like Jake Shields or Nick Fuentes or Candace Owens or there's a few other big Andrew Tate, big names that are very anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. And my argument is generally in those conversations that I think that if I were Jewish, I would probably prefer to see the anti-Semitism in the open than I would hidden away. Because just because it's not being verbalized, it doesn't mean it's not there. Just because you ban someone doesn't mean that that person doesn't exist and he's not spreading his ideas on Rumble or on 4chan or on Discord or wherever else it is they go. I have very, very mixed feelings about this. I think there is a.
You're saying there's a place for it. There is a place for
content. I'm not saying in an ideal world, people would all strive for the truth and be good and post things that are good and useful for society and that make the world a better place. And there would be no need for content moderation. It's again, it's Popper's paradox, isn't it? If you tolerate the intolerant, you end up essentially being taken over by the intolerant. So I have very mixed feelings because I feel that if you start moderating, where does it end? And on the other hand, the amount of fake news and vicious, I mean, really just vicious, vile content that exists out in the world suggests that perhaps it should be moderated. The truth is, I'd have to really think about this, Azhar. I don't know.
What do you think about?
What do you think, Azhar?
That's a great question. I would say, honestly, I'm also on the fences. I'm being completely honest. If somebody had a gun to my head, I would definitely incline towards free speech, becoming a free speech absolutist. But since our initial conversation, I really gave a lot of thought to it. Like, when we spoke about doing this podcast, I started thinking about what you said to me, started looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the more on the fences I became. It's because, yes, I do see, for example, if someone is pushing pedophilia or sexualization of young girls or even boys, absolutely, you cannot allow that to happen. That's not acceptable. Those kids do not have the mental capacity to make decisions long-term. And unfortunately, from that, you had Russell Peters. I was watching his podcast a few days ago, and he was like, my girl came up to me when she was 11 years old, and she was like, I want to be a boy. And Russell was like, no, we are not having that, because you cannot like fix that if you end up realizing that was the wrong decision. You can't take it. Right. So because of which, I absolutely see a place for content moderation, but it goes into where it becomes a difficult thing for me is when government gets involved. And every government in the world has its own agenda. And and then it becomes a very slippery slope. Like, where do you actually stop? I was going to ask you about the people who posted on X in the UK recently, and then now they're jailed, some for like 2 or 3 years. UK is threatening that they would extradite Americans who are
Sure.
promoting in their country. That's according to the
Sure.
UK, that Americans are promoting riots. What do you think about that? Like that particular incident?
I think it's incredibly worrying. I think that in a country where you had the Rotherham scandal of some 1,400 mostly white British working class underage girls be groomed and sexually abused over the course of 3 decades by primarily and unfortunately Afghani and Pakistani Muslim men,
Mm.
um, and ignored by the British authorities. And one of the ringleaders who was meant to be deported 9.5 years ago to Pakistan, still living in the UK. I think that it is a very shocking thing to suddenly be able to run 24/7 courts and speed run these trials and jail people for speaking their minds. And the riots weren't, it wasn't the murder of the three girls in Southport by a man who's born to Rwandan refugees, migrants. That wasn't, the argument was, oh, he wasn't Muslim, and and a lot of the comments that are being jailed are for alleged Islamophobia. The frustration has come from, there have been a number of grooming scandals across every single major British city with a large Muslim population. That has happened, unfortunately.
Mm.
And there's been an epidemic of knife crime. In 2022, I believe it was 50,000 cases, including a sharp object, so including a knife,
Right.
50,000 offenses. That's an epidemic right there. And um, and obviously you have there does seem to be a correlation between migrants from certain countries and certain crimes. And the frustration of the British people is very understandable. And I think jailing people for, I don't endorse the rioting. I don't think rioting and looting in Greg's bakery is a useful thing to do. Um, and some of the slogans and some of the things that were said, I think are objectively silly and not particularly thought through, and 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 certainly not very intellectual. But I also think that, this is kind of the revenge on the plebs, where the British establishment is hammering down on, and they didn't, there was, there was a riot in the UK just a few weeks ago in Leeds, in the Hare Hills. Some Romani children were being taken into police custody to be taken into child protection services, from a Roma family.
Mm.
Um, and that ended up leading to a riot in a majority Muslim area of Leeds. And I haven't seen anyone be jailed for that. And this is kind of this revenge on the white working class who has been it's been most affected by mass migration. The effects of and obviously, there was a pro-migration activist who lives in central London, who wrote a rather silly post recently saying, well, I don't see, I'm walking around Mayfair. I don't know if it was Mayfair or Belgravia, one of the two most expensive neighborhoods of London, and said, oh, I'm seeing all these Muslims shopping and with beautiful sports cars and going to Harrods and buying stuff and boosting our economy. And absolutely no one's complaining about those migrants or guests or tourists who knows who they are. I mean, obviously, they might even be citizens for all we know. Um, that's not what people are complaining about. People are complaining about the mass migration of low skilled,
Mm.
difficult to employ individuals who are suppressing the wages of the British working class, and who are leading to a lack of social cohesion, who aren't integrating in the customs and traditions of Britain, and who bringing in many cases a fairly radical Islam. We've seen this. We've seen this with extremist preachers in the UK. I mean, we recently had Abu Hamza was recently jailed for incitement.
Talking about you said something around the lines, the collapse of Western civilization or to destabilize your and the Pakistani ambassador, because I used to live in London, I lived there for 7 years.
Sure.
So the Pakistani ambassador told me when I had the privilege of meeting him, he passed away a few years ago. He told me that there was a joke in Pakistan that if you cannot get a visa to the UK for like as a student visa, a work visa, say on your application that you are a religious scholar and imam, and they will give you the visa straight away. Like, he was like, so when you allow people like that to come into your country, and then you're like, wait, why is this radical Islam spreading around the country? And talking about, being a Pakistani, I feel very unfortunate that there is a problem of grooming white girls within British Pakistani communities all over the country, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And the community hasn't owned up to it. The community has not taken responsibility. They're still stuck in, oh, this is racism. You don't blame other people when they do. This problem is quite exclusive to British Pakistani community from all the evidence that we have seen. And it's about time that the community does something about it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
I think I've said it all, Azhar. I think I've said it all. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, a real pleasure meeting you. A very interesting conversation. I hope I've brought something interesting to the table.
More than some things, brother. You spoke very eloquently. I'm really happy we had this conversation.
I appreciate it.